and welcome to the first ever episode of The Brood Sages, Stormbound players with a head for the game. I am your host, Freeloader, and with me, as always, is my co-host, Subaiku.
Hey,
Subaiku,
everybody.
how's it going?
Fantastic. How are you doing today?
Well, I am excited for our first episode of this podcast, I can tell you that. I think we're going to
It's
go a little different this time. So, for those of you who are fortunate enough or unfortunate enough to stumble upon this and listen, every episode's not going to quite be like this. We're going to try to give you a little more background on us and our views on the game than we will in a normal episode. But we're going to hopefully give some of you an idea of where we're coming from so that in future podcasts, if you're listening to us and wondering, this is going to be a little different than most of the episodes of this podcast. Subaiku and I are going to give you more background on us as players and how we came into the game and what our views are of the game sort of fundamentally, so that we can create a framework through which we review cards and decks in future episodes. So if you're unfortunate enough to stumble upon this episode and listen to it, first off, God bless. And second off, not every episode is going to quite be like that.
That's right. This episode, we're going to lay down a foundation. We're going to let you know where we're coming from, and that'll really inform a lot of the future discussion that we have.
That assumes that the future discussion we have is informed at all.
Depends on how many beers I've had before we start.
Well, we are the Brood Sages. So, Subaiku, would you like to get started? Give a little background of who you are as a player, where your background is. Obviously, start probably, I'm going to say, with Magic the Gathering. How many years you played
Yeah.
that?
So, as far as serious card games go, I've really only played a couple of collectible or trading card games for an extended period of time. It started in high school playing Magic the Gathering back in the day. That was over 20 years ago now. And really kind of put it down, put card games in general down for a long time until I picked up Hearthstone. That was a game that I played really pretty much daily for about 6 years before it got untenable and I didn't want to continue anymore. At that point, Freeloader had found Stormbound kind of by random chance, and we both started playing. We've been in it about 6 months now.
7, I think.
7 months now. I think we have finished our sixth full month as of this recording in August, at the end of August. Our first month was a partial month where we were in the Silver League. We have, in those 6 full months, both made it to Diamond 1. And I think that gives us really an interesting perspective on the game in that we are still new and still learning, having been in the game a relatively short period of time, but we've also made it to the highest level in the game.
Yeah, and just to jump on that same train, I also started Magic the Gathering in high school specifically because of Subaiku. He introduced me to the game. I played that through college, got away from it as well to start a career in a adult life, quote unquote. Got into Hearthstone specifically because Subaiku introduced me to the game. Played that for about 5.5 years. I got out a little earlier than Subaiku did. I played in the THL, Hearthstone competitive team league for several seasons. Won a championship. Won a championship while I was there, and really enjoyed that for a while. But found Hearthstone kind of got a little stale to me. The cycling of introducing new cards that were broken into community complaints, into nerfs, into repeat and rinse as needed just got to be a little too much for me. And so, yeah, we started searching for a new game. We found Stormbound, and it took I would say about 4 months to make Diamond for us. And then we needed to take a pause there, mostly because the game has some interesting sort of ceilings that are artificially created by card leveling. I'm not sure that I would have known enough about the game early on. So in some ways, I'm actually rather thankful that the game is set up in such a way that it kind of forces you to spend some time learning the game as you level your cards up. I think by the time seasons 5 and 6 came around, we were ready to hit D1, both in terms of obviously card levels, but also a better understanding of the higher level game of play that's needed to win through Diamond.
I will agree with that. The game, I think, in general, I think the game slows you down a little more than I would like in terms of progression. And I say that because if you are a good player with, say, level 2 and 3 cards, you are constantly beating your head against players with level 4 cards, and it's just a little more challenging to overcome a multi-level card disparity. If you're all level fours playing against all level fives, I think in general that's more viable than level twos and threes competing against somebody with level fours and fives.
It's interesting that you say that because we both made Diamond in 4 and 5 months. We both made D1, Diamond 1, 6.5 months, something like that.
I was in my sixth season. You were in your fifth season on the very last day.
So the question is, when did you first make Legend in Hearthstone?
Now that's a good point, because I was definitely years into Hearthstone, at least a year into Hearthstone before I made
Oh,
Legend for the first time.
hold on,
But
hold on, hold on, hold on, because all cards on the table.
do you have data here?
You introduced me to the game right after my daughter was born.
Mm-hmm.
I made Legend before you did.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, I made Legend before they changed the rule about resetting four levels below your finish, right? Or 5 levels below, whatever it was. So
Right.
I had to
Before the floors were introduced
before
at
the
ranks 15, 10, and 5.
correct. I believe my daughter was over. I believe it was June of the year that my daughter was 3 years old. So that would be give or take 3 years and a month or two that I took to make Legend, and you made Legend, I want to say maybe a month or two after that. So it was years
No,
before.
it was actually significantly later than that. What you're remembering is a run that I made where I got to rank 1 with full stars, lost that last game a couple times, and didn't quite make Legend.
Oh my gosh, you're right.
Now,
You're absolutely right.
I will say in Hearthstone, it is less a function of how well you play and more a function of how much you play, simply because when there was no floor, or it's like in Stormbound, if you started off at bronze again every single season on the reset, every single month you start off in bronze and you have to make your way back up. It's not that it's difficult to win games in bronze and silver and in gold. It's just that it takes time. And if you're only playing a couple games a day, you just don't put in enough time to make that happen.
Right. Well, and
And
go ahead.
I believe the first month after the floors were introduced is the first month that I made Legend, and basically made it whenever I felt like putting the time in after that.
So do
But
you, right, and we both made Legend multiple times in Hearthstone, but do you think, because I want to bring this back to Stormbound now, do you
mhm.
think that the laddering ranking system in Stormbound was, or I should say felt unfixable, like, without better card levels, this is just as high as I can get. Do you think
Yes.
that, do you think that feeling is different than the feeling we had when we couldn't get past, let's say, rank 10 to 5, and we were just getting, 10 to 5 every month? Do you think that feeling is different solely on the basis of, well, I would make it higher if I had better, more time? Do you
Yeah,
think?
I do think the feeling is different between the two games, because in Stormbound I feel like I need more resources to compete, and whether those resources are fusion zones or gold or cards, however you want to define that. I know that the answer is if I had more resources, I would be even with my opponents, not even have an advantage over them, just be at a level playing field with them. Whereas in a Hearthstone, you're already going in even. The question is just, can I play better than a 50% win rate? The answer is definitely yes. How much better than 50% really depended on how good the deck was. Right? When I was playing Pirate Warrior with patches, it was way higher than 50%. And every month, the cycle was we would compete and stay floating with decks that were fun but not as good. And then we would switch to Pirate Warrior in the last week of the month and blow through ranks, 7, 6, on our way to rank 5 just to make sure we got the better reward chest at rank 5.
See, it's interesting that that's how you remember the game because I a a lot of like life events happened to me during our tenure in Hearthstone. So obviously we started right after my daughter was born. 3 years into that, or 2.5 years into that, we bought another house and we moved, and we've since moved again. So I've got all of these sort of life events that I tie things to, and I vividly remember the house 2 years ago, or two homes ago, pardon me, when we were just getting started. How I was playing nothing but Zulak because I couldn't build any other deck. And then we had Zulok, and then after a while we finally unlocked BLM or BR Black Rock Mountain, pardon me. We finally unlocked BRM, and suddenly I had Quick Shot, and we could play mid range hunter now because I had Quick Shot. And I just remember for so long being outclassed playing a token style Zulok into Grim Reaper or Grim Patron, pardon me, warrior, and how we were just like deck after deck was just outclassing what I could put down until finally we got to the stage which took 3 years to have a library strong enough that and that was around the time that Mean Streets of Gadgetson came out and we had access to patches, and but it took us years to get a library stable enough, especially in the classic set of Hearthstone, such that we were able to build, give or take, whatever deck we wanted.
That is fair, and I might be looking back with rose-colored glasses because those early couple years were so long ago. But it also didn't feel like you were really beating your head against the wall because every month you would finish a little higher on ladder, finish at rank 17, then rank 15, then rank 12, and then pretty soon we were consistently making rank 10, and it was just always, we were always doing better.
And you don't feel like you
Here,
have in Stormbound every
uh,
month you've done
well,
better?
every month I have done better, and I'm not disagreeing with that. But that's fair. I don't know why it feels different to me. I think it feels different because I do, for the most part, have the cards, except for Dr. Mia, and I can build the decks, just that I build the same deck my opponent has, and I lose because my decks have cards that are just worse than my opponent's, even though they're the same cards, and that feels bad.
See, I think that you finally hit the nail on the head as to where I see the discrepancy. When we started in Hearthstone, we had 3 years of not being able to play the decks that everybody else could. In Stormbound, within weeks, we were able to play most of the decks that, or very similar mixes of most of the decks that we were competing against. The difference was literally my gifted recruits loses to your gifted recruits. Like one for one, each card in our deck just sucked a little more than the cards that we were playing against. And so it creates this weird feeling of I'm playing the same deck you're playing, and yet somehow the deck is stacked against me.
Yeah.
Right? It's
Somehow I'm still the underdog, and I need to play better and play smarter than everyone I face. And even now, my base health is 16. I still really only match up with people that are 17, 18, 19, 20.
I will give a big shout out to Sheepyard for the choice of limiting the base health in the leagues until Diamond, obviously. But I feel like limiting base health to 17 in Platinum, for example, was a really fair and reasonable thing to do to the game to make it. This last season was a lot more enjoyable in terms of just sort of feeling like there was parity between me and my opponents. Although it did make it
Right.
much harder to know what level cards to expect. You see the base 17, you're like, I don't know, is it going to be a level 3 opener, a level 5 opener? Let's find out.
And that could be frustrating when you're trying to play around specific cards, but knowing there was a cap on the amount of damage that I had to do really helped when your cards are a little under leveled. You know,
Yeah.
my alignments were level 3 to start off the month, and knowing that that was still good enough because that extra point of damage didn't matter. It wasn't the difference between am I trying to do 17, 18, 19 points of damage. It was just I know I need to hit 17, so 3 is good enough. If I boost these up to level 4, it's a bonus, but it's not a requirement.
Overall, just to put an end cap on this particular section of our discussion about our migration from Hearthstone to Stormbound and trying to feel out the differences, and certainly there's different frustrations in both games. I would say that Hearthstone was a deeper love for me than Magic ever was. I absolutely adored Magic. Spent money that I'm embarrassed to admit on Magic. Hearthstone for a very long time was a huge love for me, but it was a bittersweet ending. I'm happy I'm out of Hearthstone. I would say overall, yes, there are some frustrations in Stormbound, but I think that's going to be true of any game you play. Personally, I would say that I have found a second love. I really enjoy this game to the point that I want to make a podcast about it. I don't know. I don't want to speak for you. So, for you, is this just a good replacement because you're sick of Hearthstone, or is this truly in and of itself a game that you feel is worthy of your time and attention?
This is definitely not just a rebound because I broke up with Hearthstone. This is a different game. The mechanics are different. The way the game plays, the way the game feels is different. I enjoy it very much for what it is. It is not, it is a replacement in the sense that Hearthstone was a game that I played every day, and I no longer wanted to do that, but it's definitely not a just good enough for right now kind of thing. This game that was created by Paladin and now picked up by Sheepyard is a beautiful little self-contained game. It is fantastic. It is fun. It is easy to learn and hard to master, and that's really everything that I was trying to find.
Agreed. So moving on from there, we're going to, for this particular episode, like I said, we're going to kind of give our takes on the four factions of Stormbound. We have not discussed ahead of time who's going to take which one. So I will defer to you, Subaiku. You take your picks as to which two you want, and then go ahead and start with the first one. Just kind of give an introduction to it and talk about, some of the mechanics that are specific to it and the kinds of decks that you would expect to build with those mechanics.
I'm going to start with Shadowfen because that is the primary faction that I play. For some reason, it was the first one that I tried out, and as soon as I started playing it, I knew it was right for me. It is the most interesting of the factions, I think, because the two mechanics that it works with are very, very different. There is a convert mechanic in which you swap enemy units to your side, and there's a poison mechanic where you damage enemy units. And there's a minor mechanic also in which you drain from enemy units. This overlaps with the poison mechanic in the Amberhide unit, which is fantastic fun to poison an enemy unit, drain it of its health, and then use it to attack another enemy unit. In general, I like Shadowfen quite a bit because it is about turning your opponent's strength against it. How?
I was going to just say,
Go ahead, jump in, please.
yeah, I would point out that the two main mechanics actually kind of work against each other. A poisoned minion maintains its poison, so it loses health every turn, which makes poisoned units less enticing targets for conversion. So the two
And
mechanics.
and that's good because it creates two distinct different deck types,
Mhm, agreed.
which I think is important. One of the reasons that I like Shadowfen quite a bit is because there is a lot of flexibility when you are turning your opponent's strength into a weakness when you convert it. And also, Toxic Sacrifice is an incredibly powerful card that is very flexible. You can use it to clear your opponent's units. You can use it to clear your own units to create room for runners. You can use it to poison your opponent's units. It can do a lot of very different things. And at just one mana, you can use it in pretty much any situation. So as a puzzle box, Shadowfen also has some of my favorite tools in Toxic Sacrifice, Azure Hatcher, Faithless Prophets, cards that can do different things in different scenarios, and it keeps your brain working during the game, trying to figure out, do I use this in a straightforward manner, or do I try to combo this with another card, or try to use this in an off-brand kind of way? Now, the deck that I run primarily is a rush deck, which takes advantage of a couple of key Shadowfen cards that are overstated 2 and 3 drops: Dubious Hag, Heliotropes, and Faithless Prophets. We're just looking to put a lot of pressure on early with these powerful, cheap minions, put more on the board than your opponent can clear so you can keep front and get in chip damage, and then finish the game off with Rain of Frogs and Obsidian Butchers, which is a fantastic combo. You drain your own unit to push damage into the opponent's base using the Butchers. I used to run the Hairy Chestnuts before they were modified in the last patch. They were balanced, so they are no longer as strong as they used to be. But if I got those up to level 5, I would definitely run those again.
It's interesting. I don't actually see a ton of level 5 chestnuts, even in decks that are effectively all level 5 cards. The elders seem to not be at level 5 for the vast majority of players out there.
I think that's mostly a function of their rarity, as well as once they were nerfed and no longer as powerful as they used to be, it became less of a requirement to run it and more freedom to operate in different parts of the design space.
I think that's fair. The only thing I'll add is I think that thematically, one of the things in Shadowfen that's very interesting is your pardon me, your units are overstated, but that's because Shadowfen seems to have a preponderance of units with drawbacks. Thinking specifically Faithless Prophets, Dubious Hags, and Heliotropes, or Heliotroopers, pardon me, the 3 cards that you mentioned earlier. There's a sort of a thematic Shadowfen thing where your units are actually, they're conflicted, for lack of a better term. Give me
They
another.
they are overpowered for their cost, but the drawbacks are typically something you can take advantage of. For example, Dubious Hags leaves behind a one strength unit for your opponent, which then you can take advantage of with Obsidian Butchers or Claxi and turn it into a strength for a future unit. Heliotroopers are poisoned, which means you can have them survive a trade and then hit them with your own Marcus Prey and turn them into something bigger again,
Or Brood
overstated for what,
Sages, right?
or Brood Sages and create one strength toads for yourself. All these downsides are actually all thematically and from a design standpoint within the space that Shadowfen has carved out.
Excellent. So I will take the next one since you chose Shadowfen, which is my favorite too. Damn you. I'll go with Swarm. Swarm thematically has 2 pieces to it. The first is this idea that you kind of spawn and buff. Swarm likes to have just a whole bunch of small minions spawn everywhere, all over the board, and cards like Panheralds or Moonlit Airy that then buff all the satyrs and make them bigger. The other thing that used to be unique to Swarm but is no longer is the idea of chip damage. There are other cards like Mischiefs, for example, that upon play just automatically deal damage to your opponent's face. The 2 actually, believe it or not, are thematically, they seem dissimilar, but they can oftentimes be helpful together. If you're looking to make a chip deck, a lot of times all you want to do is clog the board and make it impossible for your opponent to ever attack your base. And so Swarm can sometimes be helpful in that way. The one thing that Swarm has, one mechanic that it has that allows the Swarm concept to work is the command mechanic. So Forgotten Souls and Herald's Hymn being the 2 most notable, although there is Petrified Fossils if you need the shout out. The idea being that yes, you make all these units that don't move or barely move. They grow, they get bigger, but the army is not reaching the base. It's not actually doing any damage. You can accelerate that march down the board with these cards that command all your units forward, or one specific unit forward. That's part of the reason why, as an aggressive deck, Swarm tends to be the most successful. Yes, you can make an aggressive deck with any of the factions, but your rush style decks in Swarm have been, a bit easier to achieve with lower levels. Big shout out to Reckless, his deck, which I have used quite a bit, to just literally fly through 3 cards, 4 cards played a turn until you can drop a Potion of Growth Forgotten Souls or a Devastator's Forgotten Souls for lethal. That style deck is much easier to create, effectively at least, in Swarm than any other faction because of the existence of Forgotten Souls and or Herald's Hand, whichever one you prefer.
You did talk about zoo decks earlier in Hearthstone, and I think that style of swarm deck is the most analogous to a zoo deck. It is flood the board with cheap units. Your opponent can't clear everything. You do a lot of chip damage, and then eventually there is a finisher. What makes Swarm interesting to me is the ability to spawn a lot of tokens. You can really fill up the board very quickly, especially if you have high level cards. And that allows you to, like you said, buff and finish with Potion of Growth and Forgotten Souls or Herald Him. And it can really take a game that looks like it's going to go long and make it very short.
Yeah, I mean that's the nice thing about those style decks is that any unit in the deck can be the finisher. All it needs is Potion of Growth put on it and Forgotten Souls to shove it over the finish line. So there is no one particular card that you're necessarily, struggling to cycle through and find. You can set up a board with 3 units this turn holding on to Forgotten Souls, and odds are, I mean, you've cycled through almost half your deck already right there. Between the 3 you just played, the odds are, the 3 you're about to draw, your odds of finding Pog are pretty good. All right, so would you like to take the next faction?
Next faction, I'll go with Ironclad, which is thematically similar to Swarm in one respect. It does like to create units and buff them, but specifically, it likes to buff constructs through mechanics like Linked Golem or Upgrade Point. There are also non-specific buffs like Fortification Tonic or Debug Loggers, but it likes to really work with that tribal synergy around the construct. It's also got some secondary push-pull mechanics, which are very interesting and a lot of fun to play with. Ozone purifiers or wind makers pushing units away, and that can be a lot of fun to work with and create some interesting puzzles. And then you also have the additional synergy of towers and Mia. So ironclad decks can play with structures in a way that other factions really cannot. What this does specifically for ironclad is it gives them a way to compete in the early game with aggressive decks like Shadowfen Rush decks or Swarm decks through the use of buffing units like Green Gale Serpents, which even buff themselves as they trade into multiple units from your opponent, or allows you to hit a opener like green prototypes into link golems that your opponent just simply can never recover from. There's a lot of snowball opportunities in the early game. The early game is very strong, but also there's a lot of value in the late game that makes a lot of ironclad decks very flexible, as well as the structure synergy, which is, like I said, unique and gives the play style something a little more interesting than what other factions do.
It's interesting. I'll throw out there that the push-pull mechanic, while a ton of fun, currently in the meta just doesn't seem to actually be effective.
That is fair. Windmakers, while windmakers do push, they also deal damage, and the damage dealing is fundamentally more critical than the actual push mechanic. The push mechanic is more of a stall than an outright clear, and typically it is preferable to clear your opponent's unit rather than just delay for a couple turns.
It's also the only class I would put out there that really is fundamentally reliant on a legendary to make one of its themes effective.
So we didn't get into this with Shadowfen, but Shadowfen does have a theme where you create a lot of small tokens through Brood Sages, through Rain, through Azure Hatcher, and while it is not necessary that you have Bragda to make that work, it sure does make that work a heck of a lot better.
Or
You can also have Klaxi to make it work, but that's more mana and later in the game, and that's obviously less preferable. Earlier is always better.
well, sure, but if you're looking for earlier, then Obsidian Butchers is even faster and it ends the game as opposed to just creating a whole bunch of value, right?
Butchers ends the game if you are close enough for that to happen. There are plenty of times when I look at my butchers and they're going to hit for 10 and my opponent is at 12, and I have to start thinking, is this actually worth it to take this punch now? Should I try to keep my front and try to do lethal damage later in the game? Or is it worth it to take this punch for 10 and then try to fight my way back down the board to sneak in a runner for the last 2 damage later?
That's fair.
With Bragda, you're not making that choice. You are just saying, I'm going to create overwhelming value on this turn. You can't recover because I'm putting just too many stats on the board, and now the game is mine.
Reasonable, but I would say the structure style Ironclad decks are more dependent on Mia than Shadowfen Frog Spam or Toad Spam or token style decks are dependent on either Klaxi or Bragda.
You're catching me at a good time with this because I do not have Mia in my collection, and we just finished the structure brawl. And when all the towers cost 2 less and you don't have Mia, that is essentially unwinnable whenever you play another Ironclad deck. So I will agree with you that Mia is a requirement to make that work because the effect is unique. No matter what level your Mia is, if you have it at level 1 or at level 5, you're still triggering the structures. And without Mia, you're just not. And it just doesn't work without that.
Right. All right, and then the last faction in Stormbound is neutral. There used to be Winter Pact, but it got nerfed out of existence. And no, I'm just kidding.
Oh, that's mean. I will say I do still run into Winter Pack players after the balance changes. They are still perfectly viable.
Yeah, yes. Shout out to all those Winter Pack players who obstinately continue to play an irrelevant class in Stormbound. I appreciate that it's the only class that you've leveled up to level 5 cards, and way to stick with it, buddy.
Well, and this goes back to what we were saying earlier. It takes a lot of time and a lot of resources to level up your cards to the point where they are competitive. If you have picked a faction and those cards are changed, you're kind of just out of luck. You have to spend another 6 months leveling up your cards in a different faction and accumulating resources. And it feels like starting from scratch.
I mean, that is fair to an extent, and I would agree with that. I would more agree with that if we were talking about Shadowfen or Ironclad, which I feel are two classes that tend to be playing more class-specific cards, or pardon me, faction-specific cards. Swarm and especially Winter Pack play a ton of neutrals. It is not unusual to see someone posting an effective Winter Pack deck that literally has 3 or 4 Winter Pack cards in it, and the other 8, 9 cards are neutrals.
That's fair. However, those do tend to be more rush or aggressive decks, which is not a playstyle that Winter Pact really naturally gravitates to.
No, that's
Winter
true.
Pact
That's
Winter Pact
true.
has a lot of high mana cost cards, a lot of freeze effect, and a lot of mana acceleration effect, like Rhymelings and Gift of the Wise and Frozen Core. Now, those lend themselves to decks with a higher mana curve because you can do more on a turn when you ramp your mana. So saying that, wow, this Winter Pack deck leans on a lot of neutral ones and twos is not surprising because there are no real aggressive Winter Pack ones and twos.
Right. That's very true. So we've been going through and talking about the mechanics in each class. The mechanics for Winter Pack are primarily centered around freeze effects and synergies with freeze effects. And freeze effects obviously just stop your opponent's units from being able to move at the start of their turn. And then the other mechanic is surrounding ramp or mana ramp or mana gain, depending upon what game you play or are familiar with. You'll recognize one of those terms. And Winter Pact is the Druid for you Hearthstone players out there. It's the Druid class of Stormbound. It gets all the mana ramp stuff. Interestingly, it's actually the faction that has the best synergy between its two main mechanics, I would say, because
Yes.
you can't really effectively ramp and lose tempo and give up on turns to do things like play a tower and nothing else without having some sort of stall mechanism to delay your opponent's aggression until you get the payoff from those early investments. And so it's almost impossible, I think. I'm not going to say totally impossible, but it's almost impossible to play a ramp style, big, aggressive, juicy winter pack deck without at least some freeze effects to help stall until you can play your, whatever it is, your Mad Bombers or your Victors of the Melee or your Siren, like, whatever it is that you use to kind of try to turn the board late. So of the four factions, it had the best synergies between its two. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending upon how you look at it, the recent nerfs to the game that Sheepyard brought out slowed down the mana gain to a level that has made it apparent that the other non-mana gain, non-freeze cards in Winter Pact are really sadly insufficient to keep the faction within the sort of meta. So yes, people who have extremely overpowered all level 5 style cards even now can easily make it into Diamond and above with Winter Pact. But for everybody else, Winter Pact has become really hard to play because with the one big sort of payoff and super powered mechanic being nerfed and the freeze effects had already been previously nerfed by Paladin, the end result is just a class that currently at least struggles to have anything with the same power level as the other three factions. I have posited this before, and I'll say it again now, and I don't know if now's the exact time to have this conversation, but I am of the opinion that ramp just constricts design space too much in any game. Whenever you see ramp, the faction or class or whatever you want to think of it that has ramp tends to have one of two things: either complete dominance over the entire game or incredibly crappy cards that you simply never want to play despite having all the mana in the world to do so. But those are the problems, right? Is you want to give a payoff. There's no point in passing on your first couple of turns just to try to gain mana on subsequent turns if there isn't some great payoff. But if you make that payoff actually worth the price that you pay, then the deck itself just becomes too powerful, right? Like anybody who whiffs on a turn or misses a perfectly mana efficient turn playing against those style decks suddenly find themselves housed. And you can see the pendulum swing back and forth. I recall for quite a while in Hearthstone where Druid was terrible because it was just getting run over by all these aggressive decks. Suddenly you get Spreading Plague, and oops, now it's the most powerful class in the entire game because as soon as you give them enough time to ramp, you run into this problem that, well, the late game is too powerful and no other faction, class, what have you, can possibly answer it.
Yes and no. You talked about payoff being the problem, and in Druid, it was not just spreading plague as a stall mechanism, but ultimate infestation as a payoff. You got to 10 mana, and you immediately removed a minion from the board, put a minion on the board, had some health gain, and drew a bunch of additional cards to spend now that you were at 10 mana ahead of your opponent's schedule.
That's very fair. That's
in in Stormbound, the payoff for mana acceleration is a big lady rhyme or the ability to play more units than your opponent can play, or the ability to play something like Siren of the Seas, which can clear multiple units for a relatively small 9 mana, which isn't concerned when you have Gift of the Wise and you have well over 9 mana to spend on turn what used to be turn 7, what is now turn 8.
Yeah, I mean, so yes, going back to the analogy in Hearthstone, I would argue that without Spreading Plague, Ultimate Infestation was an irrelevant card because the game never got there.
And without Ultimate Infestation, Spreading Plague was an irrelevant card because you weren't stalling for anything in particular.
And it's certainly true that the card draw was ridiculous in it. But, bring that back to Stormbound now, and, with freebooters, you don't actually need to have a uber powerful, totally unplayable until turn 8 unless you manage to hit your ramp style card. You can play a mana ramp deck with freebooters and just have effectively a mid-range deck that is unfairly, if you will, able to play, 6, 7 cards a turn because of freebooters, right? So none of the cards are necessarily overpowering, but the turns are because all of these sort of mid-range sized units, there's just too many of them being played at once. When you add up the total health being dropped on the board across multiple units, it's just unrecoverable.
That's fair, and that's a legitimate concern. And honestly, I am surprised when anybody builds a winter pact in a way that doesn't take advantage of relatively cheap units and Gift of the Wise and freebooters. But to that point, it is really easy to get stuck with a hand where you're playing Gift of the Wise and freebooters, and you draw a few cards and you're still only playing 8 or 9 mana worth of stuff. Yes,
Yes.
it's more cards than your opponent, but you're not spending more mana than your opponent, and that kind of balances it out. And the only way to make that deck work consistently is to not have a high mana curve, so you're never really taking advantage of gift in the first place.
Right.
You see where I'm going with that?
Yes, we've experimented with this quite a bit, centered around the card Mistwives, where we're trying to just put the most aggressive rush deck we can, filled with cards that activate Mistwives, so 4 health or above, and fitting gift into it with or without freebooters. It's been underwhelming because, as it turns out, the whole hand is just playable without the gift. You know,
Now, part of that is a function of our freebooters still being level 3. At least mine, I believe yours are too. They only draw one additional card, they don't draw two.
yes, that is
Drawing
true.
2 cards is more than twice as good as drawing 1 card.
Oh, no doubt,
It is
no doubt.
exponentially better.
Oh,
However,
okay. So
with that being said, you can still very easily get in a situation where you can dump your whole hand and the extra mana is not helpful. So at that point you just have to think to yourself, is this even worth including in my deck? And a lot of times the answer is no, because you don't have a top end that's taking advantage of it.
right, exactly. It's interesting to note that the only real way for Winter to take advantage of the, obscene amount of mana generation that it can create late game is Lady Rhyme or Visions of the Grove, and it turns out that neither of them are particularly effective. With confinement being in the game, Lady Rhyme has a limited amount of use. I mean, you can win any game that you can get into the late game and play Lady Rhyme when your opponent doesn't have it, but expecting the meta to not have confinement is probably ill-advised. And
On the other hand, you're taking advantage of any opponent that tries to run an optimized deck, because confinement is not something you want to shoehorn in anything other than a defensive deck.
Yeah, that is very true. And then Visions of the Grove, while a really cool deck or card and concept, it turns out without enough delay, the deck just can't work. Freeze effects either need to be a lot stronger, or there needs to be more AOE in the game, or something. It's just
Yeah.
very difficult to ever use Visions of the Grove as an actual win condition, despite the fact that it is such a cool mechanic.
It's a cool mechanic. It's just as it is the only card in the faction with that mechanic, and as a one of like that, it's so hard to cycle back to it again and again and again as your win condition.
Even with
Now,
high level
we
freebooters.
we have spent way too long talking about the Winter Pact, which is not currently in the game, but I do think it's an interesting class, so I understand why. All right, let me give you some rapid fire questions here. What
Okay.
is the best faction for a new player? Go.
I would recommend for a new player, probably Shadowfen or Swarm, both of which have
This isn't a two. Pick one.
pick one. Oh man. I mean, personally, I went with Shadowfen and it made me D1 in like 5.5 months. So I would say that, but I don't know.
I
It's
think the
Shadowfen.
right answer is Swarm is, I think, a little more straightforward to play and easier to build. You do need some rare and epic cards in Shadowfen to make it work. You need fewer of those in Swarm, so I would have gone with Swarm. All right,
I actually don't think you need more epic cards in Shadowfen than you need in Swarm. I think you need the same number.
fair.
But anyway,
I played Shadowfen early on with Soul Crushers because I packed a lot of them early and got it up to level 3 very quickly. And it turns out
obscenely
in
quickly.
gold rank level 3 Soul Crushers really does some work for you, win you some games. And then I moved on to incorporating Brood Sages into a lot of my decks, which is another epic. And I played Klaxi a lot early, so.
Toxic Sacrifice and Witches are two cards that just first off, if it's ever a tie between two factions, the next question is, well, which one beats which? And Shadowfen destroys Swarm. So in the tiebreaker between those classes, I would say it's Shadowfen, just because, well, if nothing else, you'll beat up on all the Swarm players.
That's reasonable. That leads me into the next question, which is the most flexible faction.
Oh, there's no doubt about it. Shadowfen is the most. That's the other reason why I think for a new player you should invest in Shadowfen, is because if you're an aggressive style player, great. You know what? There's incredibly effective aggressive style decks. David G has a Shadowfen deck that I think tops out at 4. It might top out at 3
It tops out at
mana.
3.
It's insane. It tops out at 3 mana. 3 mana. He made D1 with it. On the hard control side of things, there's so many good control options in the class. In fact, Frosticon has created a deck that is all control and chip. It never bothers trying to ever put a minion on your opponent's base. Its only goal is to just protect and protect and protect and chip and chip and chip. And it is an effective Diamond 1 deck as well. So I would say there's no doubt about it. There's only one class that sits at the top of the flexibility podium.
All right. What is the most resource intensive, most expensive
Mm.
faction?
Well, because Winter doesn't exist as a faction currently, it's going to go to Ironclad. Ironclad, has two problems to it. One, the aggressive style Ironclad decks really want to run like green prototypes and Destructo bots with linked golems. And linked golems is an epic. And so the
And
deck,
Protos and Destructobots are both rares also.
right, yeah, not for nothing. That's a very expensive set of open air cards. And your ability to punch up is totally dependent upon landing a linked golems and snowballing from there. Well, if your linked golems isn't a high enough level for you to ever begin the snowball effect, then guess what? You're out of luck. And then the worst part is, okay, well, fine. I'm not going to try to play an aggressive deck centered around linked golems openers. I'm going to try to play a structure deck. Do you have the legendary Mia? No. Well, then don't bother. Just
Right. And we talked about that earlier. A controlling structure-based deck that runs True Shot and Mia, by definition, requires an epic and a legendary.
yeah, and Siege Assembly needs to be in there as well, but that's also, I believe, a rare at least, right?
A rare, yes.
it's just very difficult to make an ironclad deck at low levels be excessively effective and punch above its weight. Meanwhile, when they're all at level 5, let me tell you how effective that class can be. If you have a mature library and you have level 5 boomers, even level 4 boomers, but level 5 true shot and level 5 siege tower, holy smokes, is that an effective class. That's one of the best classes at D1, I believe.
Especially after the recent balance changes. I will agree with that. All right. What is the most interesting faction to you?
Currently, having hit Diamond 1 with Shadowfen, the answer would have been Shadowfen until I hit Diamond 1. And now the question is, what do I want to look at next? What am I personally most interested in? And the answer to that is, oddly enough, I really want to try to make an aggressive dragon and or pirate ironclad deck. So I'm going to say ironclad right now has the most interest for me. There's some interesting effects. I really love Green Gale Serpents. I'm going to give a shout out to one of the cards that I really want to try to find a way to incorporate into an effective rush style deck. The problem is I'm finding it very difficult to synergize it with any other cheap dragons because all the other cheap dragons suck.
Except for maybe Spare Dragonling, which is a value-oriented tool. It's really not helpful in an aggressive style deck. All right, now on the flip side, what is the least interesting faction to you?
The outside of a single card, and I kid you not, I have built winter pack decks with Mistwives, Frost Hexers, Rhymelings, and nothing else from the faction. All other 9 cards are neutrals because aside from Mistwives, there's really not a card in winter pack that gets me overly excited. I love Mistwives. I love the concept of it. I also simultaneously hate the concept of it because I feel like it punishes new players who don't have libraries filled with, level 4 green prototypes, level 4 gifted recruits, etc., etc. But with that in mind, I feel like Mistwives is such a cool card, and when paired with, other high level cards for a rush deck, it seems neat. The rest of the class really doesn't interest me much.
That's fair.
So I think we've produced more than enough content for tonight.
I
Um,
think when you cut it down to actually insightful and interesting things, we'll be down to about 10 minutes or so. So that's worth it.
well, don't worry, I won't cut it down that far. I'll even leave this banter in so that we can be self-deprecating, because who doesn't like a good self-deprecating podcast?
But nobody likes podcasts with banter. Come on.
Well, that's also true. Anyway, for all of you who did hang on and listen to all of this, I'd like to say thank you very much. We really appreciate it. If you have any ideas or thoughts, feel free to reach out. The easiest way to get a hold of us is either through our Twitter. I am inappropriately at this point in my career named Freeloader HS at Twitter, or you can find us in the Stormbound Discord. If you join the official Stormbound Discord, feel free to reach out and ask any questions. We'll try to incorporate those into our next episode, and we'll do our best to answer them either as well as we can or as hilariously inaccurately as we can, whichever. And we'll leave it up to you to decide which one we did.
Oftentimes we'll do both at the same time.
It's so true. All right. Well, thank you all very much for listening tonight, and hope you enjoyed it, and look for us next time. Until then, this is Freeloader saying, I don't know what I'm saying. What am I saying? Subaiku, what am I saying?
You're saying that you promise we'll be a little more polished in a couple of months. We're getting a couple episodes under our belt as we try to figure out what we're doing here and how we want this podcast to sound and what topics we want to cover. But until then, thank you. Have a good night, and we'll talk to you soon.